Okay. All right. May 1st. Happy May Day. This and that information. Uh, the autonomous collective.net. More rentier capitalism. I've read on rentier capitalism before, uh, and I've actually probably done part of this article before, but it's, I think, important to come back to. Yesterday, discussed a little bit about rentier capitalism in the UK and that it actually can be measured. Um, there are even tables and charts and graphs. Here's one of them, a Brett Christopher's one, which describes the differential assets that can be described under a rental stream, um, and all quite relevant, actually. And here is a diagram from the article that I'm going to read from today, and that's Birch and Ward. Um, a uh, a good article, and this diagram describes, the different kind of economic rents that the range of economic rent to rentiership, uh, as it were, and uh, and all the different elements that can come into play, and that there are, in fact, a very neoclassical versions of the idea of rent or rentier. So the discourse is quite broad. There is a Marxist element, as you can see by the little dot there, or the area. And so, anyway, Birch and Ward, critical approaches to rentiership. Introduction. The provocation of this special issue is that contemporary capitalism is different. It is increasingly dominated by rentiership rather than entrepreneurship. That is the extraction of economic rents from the ownership and or control of assets and resources rather than profits resulting from the production and sale of new goods and services. We understand economic rents as the value exacted or extracted from the socio-natural world as a result of the relations of ownership and control of particular assets or resources, primarily because of their constructed degree of scarcity or quality. The concept of rentiership adds to a geographical analysis by specifying the socioeconomic power imbalances, strategies, and processes driving wealth extraction and concentration. We circulated the call for papers in mid 2018 when unease with the prevalence of rent seeking in contemporary capitalism appeared to be coming to a head. While papers have been available online since as early as 2019, the final special issue itself has been delayed as a result of the pandemic and associated time pressures on authors. In that period, the characterization of contemporary capitalism is rentier, in the sense of being dominated by assets and their owners, has become almost commonplace. This has extended beyond academia. For example, the 2020 to 2025 strategic plan of major Canadian think tank, the Centre for International Governance Innovation, highlights the need for, quote, research and analysis surrounding how different competition frameworks could lead to changes in market power and the distribution of rents, unquote. Similar concerns with the problems associated with rentership are evident in major NGOs, the United Nations, and even the World Economic Forum. In tipping over from the margins of heterodox analysis to mainstream debate, there is a risk that the critique of rentership becomes co-opted. In the hands of the Financial Times or World Economic Forum, the concept of rent no longer functions to indicate a fundamental relationship shaping the dynamics of capitalist accumulation, but rather becomes a morality tale in which the pathological figure of the rent seeker excuses rather than explains the contemporary maladies of our socioeconomic system. The growing popularity of the concept makes it even more imperative to center critical approaches to rentership, which do not lose sight of the wider political economic processes and power dynamics in which rentership is embedded. We have not privileged any particular approach in pursuing this aim, but have selected articles which contribute to a geographical analysis of the different modes of ownership and control of the diverse assets and resources that underpin the growing prevalence of rentership and its impacts. Conceptualizing economic rents. The call for papers for this special issue offer the following working definition of economic rents. Economic rents can be defined as the value extracted from the socio-natural world as a result of the ownership and control of a particular resource or asset, primarily because of that resource's inherent or constructed degree of scarcity or quality. This definition is reflected in Andrew Sayers and Brett Christopher's detailed accounts of the growth of asset, wealth, and power in the economy. What Sayer characterizes as improperty, and Christopher's as renterization. The use of assets to manage scarcity is operative here, something Bayoni et al. Developed by highlighting rent as a relation of control, through which scarcity can be produced and rents extracted across the value chain. At the same time, Bayoni et al. Take issue with the framing of this as an antagonistic relationship between entrepreneurship and rentership, which echoes moral economy distinctions between makers and takers, and with it implications of a good, that is, a productive, and a bad rentier capitalism. A key distinction within the critical literature evident across this special issue is a divide between what may loosely be characterized as Ricardian approaches, who identify the problem in rentiership itself, and Marxist approaches, for whom rentiership is an expression of underlying changes in the structure of labor exploitation. Both find common causes in their critique of mainstream economics' approach to rentership, but have fundamental differences in their analysis of the nature and role of market power. Our aim in the rest of this section is to orientate, yes, the reader with regard to the different conceptual approaches to rentership so as to navigate these debates. While we cannot do proper justice to the growing literature on rent theory in such a short introduction, Figure 1, which I just showed, provides a stylized mapping of key concepts and approaches from the intellectual history of economic rent as a guide. Very briefly, economic rent was a fundamental category in classical political economy, with Adam Smith's differentiation between wages and profits as forms of revenue implicated in the production and rent derived from the ownership and control of the land. As such, rent is here understood as a hangover from pre-capitalist political economic relations and a barrier to capitalist development. Subsequently, David Ricardo defined economic rent as a payment to the landlord, reflecting the differential productivity gains of using a particular plot of land over the most marginal site's differential rent. That's differential rent 1. This retheorized land rent not as a feudalistic barrier, but as an ahistorical and asocial regularity in the ownership and control of land through which the landlord may extract an quote-unquote unearned increment. due to their holding of that portion of the produce of the land which is paid to the landlord for the use of the original and indestructible powers of the soil. Karl Marx's critique of Ricardian rent theory embedded the categories of absolute and differential rent within his radicalization of classical political economy's labor theory of value and associated class-based account of the organization of accumulation. In this, Marx introduced a second version of differential rent, DR2, differential rent 2, representing both land and the capital invested in land to improve its productivity, providing the theoretical foundations for concern with quote-unquote monopoly rent through his theorization of absolute ground rent. Monopoly rent has since been differentiated between monopolies based on natural or inherent rare qualities, for example, vintage grapes, MR1, monopoly rent 1, and those class monopoly rents based on scarcities induced through socio-legal arrangements such as neighborhood redlining, which is monopoly rent 2. Here, rentiership is understood as a particular class position defined by its relationship to surplus value extraction, specifically aimed at squaring a labor theory of value with the existence of a significant landlord class, extracting value without being directly involved in production. By the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, economic rents had become a major political economic concern of social activists and reformers. Perhaps the most prominent of these has been the Ricardo-inspired Henry George, as in Georgism, whose extremely popular book, Progress and Poverty, identified the private monopolization of land rents as a source of many social ills and remains influential with heterodox liberal thinkers today. Work in this social liberal tradition stressed that economic rents represented an unfair form of unearned income, which rewarded passive financial capital ownership, taking that capital away from other possible production uses. Contemporaneously, the work of Alfred Marshall was significant because he extended the concept of economic rent to resources beyond land, specifically theorizing quasi-rents as a short-term advantage that reflected the capitalization of income, i.e., a valuation of its temporal yield accruing to a particular factor of production. The emergence of marginalism in economics around this time, however, theorized away issues of rent as a social or analytical problem from the perspective of mainstream economics. McGooey highlights the significance of John Bates Clark's notion of marginal productivity in this shift. She argues that it enabled Clark and other economists to reframe land and labor as like any other factor of production, with the effect that variations of Clark's formulation took hold in mainstream economic theory, entrenching the spurious belief that one's income naturally reflects the economic contributions made by the recipient. As a result, economic rent largely disappeared as a theoretical and political concern within mainstream economic debate and literature, save for the work of people like Joan Robinson, whose ideas provided the basis for the conception of rent as income in excess of opportunity cost, which Stratford argues became synonymous with payment in excess of competitive price. By mid-20th century, this was a generally accepted conceptualization of economic rent. The theme of economic rent reemerged in mainstream economics in the mid to late 20th century, but primarily in this very specific framing reflecting notions of excess, namely, as the political gaming or distortion of naturalized markets represented by the notion of quote-unquote rent-seeking. Reflecting their anti-government proclivities, free market economists like Gordon Tullock, and Ann Kruger conceptualized economic rents narrowly as government interference in markets, representing the pursuit of lobbying or regulatory capture for individual benefit. Here, economic rents are no longer an ahistorical, asocial, or even juridical set of capitalist or pre-capitalist relations and arrangements, but rather the nefarious interventions of politicians and policymakers for self-serving ends. For example, party political donations, bribes, pork barrel exchanges, etc. This framing helped shape the notion of rentier states, in which elites undermined economic and social development through their accumulation of personal wealth from things like natural resource concessions. At the end of the 20th century, there was limited interest in earlier formulations of economic rents, even in critical academic disciplines beyond as an orthodox explanation for market imperfections. The recent resurgence of interest in the topic has been largely rooted in the post-2008 concern with wealth inequality, most prominently articulated by Thomas Piketty. Piketty's famous R is greater than G, that the net rate of return on capital is greater than output growth, posits a trend by which the gap between returns to labor and returns to asset ownership is reshaping society around what Birch calls asset-based economies, and Atkins, the asset economy, the difference between asset-based economies and the asset economy. This trend has driven a discourse with wide, far-reaching resonance in public and policy circles as to the growth of extractive, financialized capital, which has become parasitical and begun to kill the host of production. This is what we read in Michael Hudson's work, and of course is referred to by Mazzucato. It is in this context of concern with wealth inequality driven by assetization that critical approaches to rentiership has witnessed a resurgence. Critical approaches to rentiership, with land rent theory never falling fully out of fashion in geography. The recent upsurge in work thinking critically about economic rents has been particularly strong in the discipline and cognate fields. Numerous recent case studies have empirically unpacked the distinct dynamics of different economic rents, exploring the specific socio-spatial arrangements necessary to turn something into the capitalized property from which economic rents can be exacted or extracted. In this, the papers in this special issue contribute to a broader ongoing project examining the geographical specificities of economic rents and their implications. Here, there is a burgeoning research agenda exploring the specific socio-spatial arrangements necessary for creating rent-bearing assets ranging from global intellectual property regimes. And there's a significant one that includes, of course, land ownership and grabbing, enclosures of natural resources, gatekeeping through digital infrastructures, the restructuring of urban environments, and corporate financialization across global value chains. This special issue contributes further to this diversity of cases, with authors unpacking relations of market power and extraction in cases encompassing value capture on urban land in Toronto and Salford, the capitalization of urban land in Laos, the financing of green technology transition in the United States, the emergence of asset economies, the transformation of care homes into assets in British Columbia, the role of intangible assets in corporate value chains, and the enclosure of natural resources in Scandinavia. Recent geographical literature has particularly focused on tracing out how rentier logics have come to shape and reshape our geographies and landscapes, in particular in problematic ways. Some of these represent locally specific value grabbing, while others represent planetary logics of accumulation of investment and disinvestment. For example, the rent gap in the renewal of capital accumulation globally. Clark and Pessan's contribution to this special issue combines these perspectives through a focus on asset formation as the enclosure of potential rent, foreclosing other potential future use values in the process. Rentier logics are especially evident in the way that the state has been retooled in the pursuit of asset price inflation, often in support of capitalist dynamics of accumulation, and sometimes in contradiction, but either way, leading to the intensification of speculation. Within this special issue, for example, Bigger and Friendly and Purcell and Ward's articles consider how the use of progressive land values capture mechanisms in urban planning has embedded rentier logics and associated governance flexibility into the local state in Toronto and Salford, respectively. Meanwhile, Knuth's and Christopher's contributions move the lens on rentier logics to the national scale. Knuth insightfully outlines the role of financial rentership in the fiscal structure of the U.S. renewable markets and its implications for the prospects of green transitions, while Christopher's overviews the United Kingdom demonstrate that rentership has become a dominant feature of the economy there as a result of changes in monetary and fiscal policy, in addition to policies related to asset ownership and property rights. Geographers have paid special attention to the extension of these rentier logics in the enclosure of common or collectively held resources, whether natural, social, or epistemic. There's particular focus on the environment as a site of enclosure and extraction. Other analyses have examined the ways that collectively produced outputs of human action are also enclosed or captured via various socio-spatial arrangements, including scientific knowledge, digital data, and platforms. The enclosure of social goods can be seen especially in the ways that social reproduction is transformed through rent logics, with Strauss's article in this special issue offering an innovative reading of rent theory as it applies to the restructuring of labor relations and the assetization of the care sector. The overarching theoretical connection between these diverse analyses is the growing centrality of assets and assetization in our economies. Many of these analyses are examining the role and relations of assets in contemporary capitalism, whether that is intangible assets like intellectual property, or tangible assets like real estate, or financial assets like securities. We can see this especially clearly with the merging of financial and digital infrastructures and geographies represented by the rise of digital platforms and ecosystems. The increasing importance of digital technologies, intangible property rights, and political economic standards and rules are critical for the transformation of social relations and arrangements into capitalized excludable property, i.e., assets from which private actors predominantly can extract or exact value. Within this special issue, for example, Bayoni et al. Highlight the importance of intangible assets to which wielding power within the global economy while questioning whether this really amounts to a step change in capitalism. This question as to whether we have undergone what can be characterized as a shift to rentier capitalism remains a live one running throughout the special issue. Nevertheless, the focus on rentership as a contrasting practice to entrepreneurship is a useful stylization to center attention on the strategies of agents from the valuation devices, techniques, and claims of business entities through to the techno-economic arrangements deployed to capture value and the moral justifications for doing so. Assigning this distinctive moral force per Sayre's notion of quote-unquote improperty remains a point of contention, with Christophers and Kenny Lazar taking aim at such a moral economy lens and rejecting the implication that there is anything especially wrong in itself with rentiership over general capitalist exploitation. The extent and nature of the division between rentiership and entrepreneurship in contemporary capitalism, as well as the politico-normative implications we may draw from that, thus emerge as key points of continuing contention in the critical literature on rentiership. Whether grounded in a moral economy perspective such as Sayre's, or an analysis based on rentiership as a moment in class struggle, it is important to remember that the transformation of things into assets is not predetermined, but always contingent and contested, open to various forms of struggle. The political economic category of rent specifies the relationship of wealth extraction at the center of the asset form and its social relations, providing a critical lens with which to explain and problematize a bankrupt capitalist common sense dependent upon further enclosures and rising asset prices, set against a co-optive policy discourse on rentiership in which the rent seeker appears as a distortive corruption of this common sense. It is crucial that critical approaches continue to center the ways in which asset-based struggles over rent extraction are integral to accumulation and social reproduction processes today. Yes, indeedy. So that gives you a kind of overview that it is something that is shared by a bunch of different types of asset accumulation processes. Here is the general definition for rentier capitalism. It's a term used in Marxism and sociology, which refers to a type of capitalism where a large amount of profit income generated takes the form of property income received as interest, intellectual property rights, rents, dividends, fees, or capital gains. The beneficiaries of this income are a property owning social class who, it is argued, play no productive role in the economy themselves, but who monopolize the access to physical assets, financial assets, and technologies. They make money not from producing anything new themselves, but purely from their ownership of property, which provides a claim to a revenue stream, and dealing in that property. Often the term rentier capitalism is used with the connotation that it is a form of parasitism, or a decadent form of capitalism. In general, you could ask the question, what happens when parasites become as big as their hosts? And there are ways of measuring and arguing that there is a continuing rentier capitalism that has grown as a matter of personal income, wage and salary disbursement, or government expenditures, wage and salary disbursements, and it's sort of there, and there's linearity there. And so there are other ways of thinking about this, and yes, I've extended a bunch of other little things here that are a series of comments on whether there was or is rentier capitalism. This is from a blog. Um, and I've probably bombed through the front end of my little conversation today and left myself probably far too much extra time. And so, in that spirit, I go to yesterday's little thing, which I did end early, and give us beyond all that sort of stuff, a little piece by Massimo De Angelis on Marx and primitive accumulation, the continuous character of capital's enclosures. In the last 20 years, the neoliberal orthodoxy became predominant in all major levels of government and shaped the policy recommendations of the major think tanks all around the world. Countries have witnessed continuous massive attacks on those functions of the state which were designed to compensate for the inadequacies and injustices of the market. Cuts in social spending have taken, of course, many forms and shapes. This depended on what was the historical and socioeconomic context in which they were implemented, either the rich countries of the North, the poor countries of the South, or the transitional countries of the East. Yet, upon a cursory reading of the enormous literature on this subject, one is left with a strong sensation there's something common between, say, the cut in unemployment benefits in Britain brought about by the need to balance the budget, the wave of privatization in Poland brought about by the need to dismantle state socialism, and the cuts in food subsidies in Tanzania brought about by the need to repay foreign debt. This paper suggests that a reinterpretation of Marx's theory of primitive accumulation may give us some important insights on the common social character of what prima facie appears to be different policies brought about by different circumstances. According to one main traditional interpretation, Marx's concept of primitive accumulation indicates the historical process that gave birth to the preconditions of a capitalist mode of production. These preconditions refer mainly to the creation of a section of the population with no other means of livelihood but their labor power to be sold in a nascent labor market and the accumulation of capital that may be used for nascent industries. In this conception, the adjective primitive corresponds to a clear-cut temporal dimension, that is the past, which becomes the condition for a capitalist future. Alternatively, the same concept of primitive accumulation has been interpreted as a continuous phenomenon within the capitalist mode of production, especially in connection to Marxist analyses describing the subordination of the global south to the global north of the world economy. In this paper, I argue that Marx's theory of primitive accumulation may be seen to contain both an historical and a continuity argument, but in forms that depart from traditional interpretations. In the second section, I briefly review the two classical approaches to primitive accumulation within the Marxist tradition. In section 3, I discuss Marx's definition of primitive accumulation and locate it within his broader analysis of the capitalist mode of production. This will lead to my highlighting of two major theoretical implications of Marx's idea of primitive accumulation. That is, the fact that it describes a forced separation between people and social means of production, and that this separation can take many forms. In section 4, I briefly expand on the latter and survey some of the forms of primitive accumulation discussed by Marx. Finally, in section 5, I return to the social meaning of primitive accumulation as identified in section 3 by drawing from Marx's theoretical apparatus, mainly his analysis of the relation between subject and object, his theory of alienation, and his distinction between accumulation and primitive accumulation. I argue that primitive accumulation is necessarily present in mature capitalist systems, and given the conflicting nature of capitalist relations, assumes a continuous character. In the conclusion, I briefly discuss the political implications of this analysis. To focus on Marx's theoretical discussion, I will abstract here from the debates around the role and meaning of socialist primitive accumulations. Also, for the same reason, I will not engage in the dissection of the meaning of the different nuances taken by the category studied when in the literature is referred to as either quote unquote original, primitive, or primary accumulation. My use of primitive accumulation in this paper is only a choice of convenience, as I believe this has been the most common use of the category, followed by original and then primary. Challenging this established custom should be the object of another paper. A brief review of the traditional interpretations. The concept of primitive accumulation is one of those ideas that has entered the common vocabulary of Marxist scholars without having generated much controversy or theoretical debate. Within the literature, it's possible to identify two main interpretive frameworks of primitive accumulation. The first one may be represented by Lenin's early study, The Development of Capitalism in Russia. This approach sees primitive accumulation mostly as the historical premise to the capitalist mode of production, and therefore focuses on the process of separation between people and means of production in the moment of transition between modes of production. In his polemic against the populists who believe that the absence of a developed market would prevent capitalist development in Russia, Lenin argued that the disappearance of the peasants and their expropriation along with that of their communities were the conditions for the creation of the capitalist market in Russia. Lenin saw this process as inevitable and ultimately positive, although he often underlined the contradictions of this process. However, these contradictions do not include patterns of peasants' resistance against expropriation and how such resistance could have contributed to create outcomes contradicting the requirements of the development of Russian capitalism. As he did not foresee a peasant resistance, he did not foresee a Russian's bloody legislation to meet that resistance. Rosa Luxemburg's The Accumulation of Capital represents a second, different interpretation. Although she formally accepted the understanding of primitive accumulation as a one-time, one-place phenomenon leading to capitalism, her theoretical framework points toward a different interpretation. In Luxemburg's framework, Marx's expanded reproduction schemes are only representation of the mathematical conditions for accumulation, in the case in which there are only two classes. In reality, she contends, capitalist production must rely on third parties. That is, other than the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, peasants, small independent producers, etc., to be commodity buyers. Thus, the enforcement of exchange relations between capitalist and non-capitalist production becomes necessary to realize surplus value. However, this exchange relation clashes with the social relations of non-capitalist production. To overcome the resistance to capital that arises from this clash, capital must resort to military and political violence. Here, Luxemburg introduces a crucial thesis that, independently from the validity of her reasoning and interpretation of Marx's scheme, seems to me fundamental. The extra economic prerequisite to capitalist production, what we shall call primitive accumulation, is an inherent and continuous element of modern societies, and its range of action extends to the entire world. Consequently, Luxemburg is able to combine her theoretical analysis of accumulation with a political conjecture. That is, once the whole world becomes capitalist, capitalist accumulation will have reached its historical end. Guess we're not there yet. Here, class struggle enters the scene as a deus ex machina before the collapse is brought about by objective conditions, as in the case of Lenin. Also, for Luxemburg, resistance and struggle are not constitutive elements of primitive accumulation, but only a possible, albeit important, byproduct. Lenin's and Luxemburg's two classic interpretations have left a mark on subsequent approaches. It is perhaps useful to label Lenin's interpretation as historical primitive accumulation to indicate an age, historically and temporally defined, describing the pattern of separation between people and means of production. Luxemburg's approach to primitive accumulation could be instead labeled as inherent continuous primitive accumulation to indicate the fact that the characteristic extra-economic process of separation between people and means of production is a continuous and inherent process of capitalist production. Subsequent, more modern interpretation seems to share the basic characteristics of these two approaches. For example, in his classic studies on the development of capitalism, Maurice Dobb uses the category of primitive accumulation to indicate a well-defined age of accumulation of property rights, better known as the mercantile age. If any sense is to be made, therefore, of the notion of a primitive accumulation in Marx's sense of the term in time to the full flowering of capitalist production, this must be interpreted in the first place as an accumulation of capital claims, of titles to existing assets, which are accumulated primarily for speculative reasons, and secondly, as accumulation in the hands of a class that, by virtue of its special position in society, is capable ultimately of transforming these hoarded titles to wealth into actual means of production. In other words, when one speaks of accumulation in a historical sense, one must be referring to the ownership of assets and to a transfer of ownership, and not to the quantity of tangible instruments of production in existence. According to Dobb, therefore, primitive accumulation is accumulation in an historical sense. It is worth noticing that also Paul Sweezy, Dobb's main opponent, in the famous debate on the transition from feudalism to capitalism, published in Science and Society 1950 to 53, acknowledges Dobb's excellent treatment of the essential problems of the period of original accumulation. The now historic debate on transition and its later developments in transfiguration, such as the Brenner debate on the pages of the journal Past and Present of the 1970s, and later exchanges in Science and Society, is characterized by a general common acceptance of the historical definition of primitive accumulation. Different from Dobbs's approach of primitive accumulation as historically prior period is the approach by Samir Amin, which is closer to the notion of inherent and continuous primitive accumulation that occurs through what Amin defines transfer of value within the world economy. Relations between the formations of the developed or advanced world, that is the center, and those of the underdeveloped world, the periphery, are affected by transfers of value, and these constitute the essence of the problem of accumulation on a world scale. Whenever the capitalist mode of production enters in relations with pre-capitalist modes of production and subjects these to itself, transfers of value take place from the pre-capitalist to the capitalist formations as a result of the mechanisms of primitive accumulation. These mechanisms do not belong only to the prehistory of capitalism. They are contemporary as well. It is these forms of primitive accumulation, modified but persistent to the advantage of the center, that form the domain of the theory of accumulation on a world scale. Another interpretation within this general framework may also include Wallerstein's notion of a world system, as we've discussed before. The continuous character of primitive accumulation in these accounts stresses objective mechanisms of accumulation and circulation of capital. A careful examination of Marx's definition of primitive accumulation allows us to critically appraise the historical and continuous arguments and reformulating them politically. The crucial idea at the core of Marx's approach is the concept of separation between producers and means of production. In what follow, I will mostly refer to this simply as separation. This concept, when inserted within the contrasting logic of boundless accumulation of capital and people's struggles for freedom and dignity, not only help us to describe the recurrent nature of primitive accumulation, but also points at the central political issue of any alternative to capitalism, that of the direct access of means of existence. Now, what happens next is a description at great length of the of Marx's definition of primitive accumulation, which we probably won't have time to get to. I'd leave that to your reading. That occurs in yesterday's, that is the 30th of April, dis and dat. But it is important nonetheless, particularly in the idea, as I was describing yesterday, of the notion, which much more fully developed in today's initial reading, is the idea of how is it that we can create kind of enclosures, or the assetization process has a certain shape, as it were. Now, let me close by, well, I don't have time to do that as well, but just point out yesterday that I included the whole article of Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, Accumulation by Dispossession, which is clearly part, as I think you can perceive, of the primitive accumulation process. That is, dispossessing people provides a means by which you can accumulate. So it is not only simply seizing, but it is also a relationship among capitals. And as you can say, Professor Harvey argues that contemporary capitalism is heavily inflected towards accumulation by dispossession, as opposed to accumulation through exploitation of living labor in production. So this is that kind of differentiation we've just described as, sort of rent defining, right? People grab stuff instead of exploiting people specifically. So large capital takes over smaller capital, and in the end, you get a quasi monopolistic situation of the large capitalist dominating all else. And you can sort of see that in the current historical situation. This is from a podcast, and it is I think, important and useful. And people who would like to disclaim David Harvey's work need to sort of read all of his work, particularly the later work, which describes a set of nuances, as it were, and describing the current situation in its sort of capitalist and anti-capitalist formulations. So anyway, I am at the end of my allotted time, so I will see if there's any commentary in the chat. No. And so I will thank you for your attention, and I will return to take out the live stream, stop the share,